Welcome to Adapted, the podcast where we explore adaptations of various forms. I'm today's host, Tom, and with me is...
Pat.
Today we'll be discussing Henry V from probably 1599, as well as Laurence Olivier's 1944 film version and Kenneth Branagh's 1989 version. A tradition holds that this play was the first ever performed at the Globe, which opened in 1599. We don't have definite proof of this, but this tends to be the thing that scholars...
I didn't know that. That's kind of fun.
And when the new Globe opened in, I think it was 1997, this was the first play performed there within that tradition. For this reason, I'd like to take a moment to mention Shakespeare's theaters. We started on this a little bit last time, but I thought I'd flesh this out. So James Burbage, the father of Richard Burbage, who played a lot of these major roles, including Henry V, he was a lead actor in the 1570s and had built the first permanent theater building in 1576 in the London area, appropriately called the Theatre. Burbage and Company owned the building, but only leased the land. In 1598, the 21-year lease ran out.
That's really dangerous, isn't it?
It's really dangerous,
Like,
and you'll hear why.
I'm going to build a building, but not own the land. That is just a recipe for extortion on that landowner.
And guess what happened? So, in 1598, the lease ran out, and landowner Gilles Allen claimed he owned the theater and said, basically, I'm not renewing the lease, but I'm going to keep the theater. Just for reference as to what that would mean financially, a theater of this sort would cost about £700 to build. The average daily income of a Londoner, not daily, excuse me, yearly income of a Londoner circa 1600 was about £10. So this was a huge loss. But during Christmas, while Allen was celebrating, the company hired a carpenter and dismantled the theater overnight and moved it to a space across the Thames, eventually rebuilding it, adding on to it, and expanding it, and that's when it became the Globe. The original Globe burnt down in June of 1613 during a production of the always exciting Henry VIII.
That is an awful play, by the way.
Yeah.
We should just mention that Henry VIII. So I'm making it my goal as we go through this podcast to try to read all of the Shakespeare plays, like every Shakespeare play. So I finished all the histories like maybe a week or so ago, and I finished them all, and I went, all right, I'm done. And then I got to Henry VIII, and I went, oh man, is this a bad play? It's not that it's poorly written, it's just so clearly that he is trying so hard not to offend the like Elizabeth. He's trying so hard. It's like he is dancing around all of the problems with like Anne Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon. Like he's trying really hard to make Anne Henry like I gotta make Henry not look bad. I can't make Catherine look bad. I can't make Anne look bad. He's desperately trying to avoid it.
Yeah.
And so it just comes across as so, to coin a phrase, to use a word that Shakespeare came up with, it's so pandering. It very much panders. And it's just really funny how just bad it is.
Yeah, I did not read this play, but I've seen it in production. And the one production of it I saw it uncut, and it put me to sleep 2 or 3 times.
Nothing happens.
Nothing really happens from what I can remember.
There's no conflict other than like they have to figure out what to do with Catherine when he wants to get divorced. But even then, they're trying to be like, well, he doesn't want to get divorced. The church forced him to because they told him he was in sin. And then they're like, well, now we're gonna back away on that. And there's just like you can't even create a conflict because he's too worried that it will make Henry look bad. So there's just nothing happens.
I woke up during the scene where they're discussing how wonderful Elizabeth is going to be when she comes of age, and everybody's just kind of going, I don't know why. I just have this feeling she's going to be amazing.
She's going to be amazing, and just like this babe, this one here he'll be the one.
Has anybody seen a baby this amazing before? I haven't. I just woke up in the middle of that being like, oh God,
and it's
still
long.
going.
It's like 4 pages of talking about how great this. That's how it ends. Actually, there's only like one scene after that, so there's just a very, very long monologue of like the bishop being like, "This baby he'll, yeah, it's basically it's she is the jewel of everything, and even though she's not a boy, I think she will be manly, and it's just like it goes on and on. It's really
Yeah.
bad.
To be
So,
fair,
but anyway, it burned down the theater.
it burned down the theater because they had fired some cannons as a special effect because they had to keep some people awake through this. It was rebuilt shortly after, but it was torn down after the closing of the theaters in 1648. Excuse me, 1642 was when the theaters were closed. The Globe was closed down in 1648 and turned into tenement housing, actually. It was rebuilt in the late 90s for the new Globe, which is like 700 feet or so from where the original one was. And as in the tradition of having Henry V be the first play ever performed at the Globe, Henry V was the first play performed at the new Globe. In 2008, archaeologists from the Museum of London claimed to have found a corner of the original theater, the one that had been where Burbage had initially built. And so we have a little bit more of an idea of what that looked like. Skipping a few centuries, in 1936, Laurence Olivier, under the direction of Paul Zenaire, and with an adaptation by J.M. Barrie of Peter Pan fame, filmed a version of As You Like It. This was widely criticized for merely being a film of a play and not, as a critic and future famous novelist Graham Greene wrote, a cinematic experience. In 1944, Olivier decided to convert Shakespeare into a cinematic experience, and keeping with the tradition of Henry V introducing a new space, let's say, to Shakespeare, he decided to do Henry V, for which he was awarded an honorary Oscar for showing people that Henry V actually could be, and Shakespeare actually could be incorporated into cinematic language. So that is my long introduction there. I can start with my general thoughts on the play. I enjoy this play, and I found, well, that's a kind of lame introductory thought. I like the Shakespeare play. I think what I enjoy,
To be fair, he does have some bad
he
plays.
does
Like, so
have
you
some
could say,
crap.
I like this Shakespeare play. This is, and it's not just to say you like it, because there is some, like, it actually is good. Like, I think there are some Shakespeare plays which, again, I always go with Romeo and Juliet. I don't actually think the play is that good. And, but this one I think is good. I think this is a good play.
Yeah, we could talk about Romeo and Juliet, but I do think this is a quality play, and I think the play is, unlike Henry VIII, far subtler than what is simply beat the drum, war march type of thing. There's a lot more going on here, and it is also deeply poetic, and there is a reason why these speeches are so inspiring to people. Because they are. They are some of the best, locker room speeches that a person can come up with ever. No quarterback is beating this. And so it's an immensely enjoyable play. What was surprising to me about it was a lot of those internal conflicts that are going on in the play, especially with the Bardolph scene and those characters from Hal's old life, how they're incorporated into it. The opening is incredibly interesting with the Archbishop of Canterbury. I love that scene. I will say again, John Keats, his concept of negative capability, of Shakespeare being able to present a bunch of different sides to things without taking preference ever. I think that criticism of Shakespeare, that analysis of Shakespeare, makes the most sense in the history plays, and it's fully on display here. It's not as prevalent as the Henry IV plays, which are, I think, better. I think Henry IV Part 1 is my
Yeah,
favorite of his history plays.
I would
Maybe
agree with that.
Richard II
Richard
is
II,
up
but
there
Richard
as well.
II's in a similar boat where he's not making an obvious answer as to what you should have done with Richard. I think he is saying you shouldn't have overthrown him, but I do think there is, they shouldn't have deposed him. But it's not an easy answer, and I think especially once you get to Henry IV, that it's very like there is no easy answer in a lot of Henry IV.
Mhm.
But Henry IV, I think, is the best. But yes, this is a very close second. It's just a different play. It's not the same.
It's not the same. It doesn't have those same complexities, and it's victorious. Ultimately, it's victorious. I don't think there's ironies in it, but I don't think the ironies undercut the glory that he's
No.
shining on Henry and on the English for this moment of accomplishment. If you want to think about it in these terms, it might be look how glorious we were at one point. I don't know if Shakespeare's doing that, but whatever. There is a certain love of the English at their height. When we got France back, and we justifiably got it back. And yes, there's some problems with that, and he is not shy about presenting those problems, but it's a wonderful testament to what I think is his country and the top of its accomplishments, the
I
height
mean, it's
of its
like a Saving
accomplishment.
Private Ryan kind of movie or something like that. Like it's a that's I think that's the era of if in American history that's the era I think we can kind of look back on and say
Mhm.
that was our
That was
best
our
moment.
greatest generation.
That was our greatest moment.
And
That's the
Henry
moment. Yeah,
was
and
the
Henry
greatest
V is the
generation.
same thing. And it's not as Saving Private Ryan does show the horrors of war. That's what I
Hmm.
don't think I don't think Shakespeare's shying away from that in this play. And I don't remember if there's anything specific in Saving Private Ryan, but it certainly makes the Americans look really good, but it's not necessarily that they're not saints. They're not
Yeah, the
perfect.
look ma I washed my hands. Do you remember that scene in Saving Private Ryan?
Which one's that?
One scene on Normandy, the German soldiers come out and they raise their
Yeah.
hands, and Tom
Oh,
Sizemore
yeah,
shoots
yeah.
them, and they turn and joke like, "Look, ma, I washed my hands
Yeah,
after
that's a good.
shooting
Okay,
these."
I don't remember that,
these-
but that's a perfect example. That's a perfect example of this kind of thing where it's not just we are the greatest generation, but it is triumphalist. It is meant to show our greatest moment as Americans. That's the moment when we should have shined. And I think this is comparable. It's showing that honestly, or maybe not honestly, but it's showing it, with a little bit of the warts to make it maybe more convincing, perhaps.
Yeah, and talking about those warts, it starts with them. That's really compelling. It starts with the chorus and whatever that gets you into it. But what's so compelling about the the beginning of the play is it starts with the justification for war being with the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is basically scared that he's going to get all of his territory taxed with some justification and lose a lot of it. And therefore, it seems like he is going to distract the king by sending him out to France in order to conquer French lands so that the church doesn't lose a lot of their territory in England. And that's how the play begins. Basically, it begins, and there doesn't seem to be any moral justification for this kind of behavior on the part of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And when the Archbishop brings his argument to the king, the argument comes off as ridiculous, that there's this kind of long lineage that justifies the French do agree that a female can inherit land, and they're not listening to this anymore. Blah blah blah. I mean, it's actually a fairly hard argument to follow because it's so kind of over the top, and both adaptations deal with that in different ways, in unique but I think particularly interesting different ways. And and then Henry kind of says, are you sure? Are you morally positive I have the justification for doing this? Because if I don't, let it be on your head that we went to war for an immoral reason.
It echoes back to that theme a little later. That theme does come up, this idea of trying to pass off your own failings onto the king or onto the church. That's
Mhm.
obviously that's the theme in the camp speech.
Mhm.
But I think this idea of who is responsible for war is, yes, definitely a theme that's being played here. Is it the
Mhm.
king is responsible? Is it just the circumstances? Is it the church? Is it politics? Is it money? What is really responsible for war? I'm not sure if the play is just saying, well, it doesn't matter because they won. That in some ways seems to be somewhat of the answer. It doesn't matter. They won.
Mhm. Yeah, I suppose, and I think the answer too is that if the reason might be somewhat corrupt, there might be some corruption in the justification for going there, but England should have France. England should have France, and maybe the road to that conquest is is a little sloppy and a little legalistic, but the world is better off. And I say that I'm still not entirely sure because the play ends with the chorus saying, and it was a glorious marriage, and then they had Henry VI, and it all went to pot pretty quickly.
Yes,
So,
I mean, yes.
the last message of it is, and none of this worked out at all, which is really, it's one of these things where I know why a lot of scholars have said the chorus was added in later. It was not really Shakespeare's invention. And I know why the scholars say that because that's an incredibly awkward thing to end the play on. I mean, it could be absolutely genius that you
I mean,
end on
part
that
of it is,
note.
but I mean, part of it again, I don't know if it's just like even the audiences, were the audiences that stupid that they couldn't just be like, we all know how that ended, though. It would be like ending the Vietnam War, or Vietnam War movie with like the Tet Offensive or something, being like, yeah, we won, something like that, or the Iraq War one, mission accomplished, and being like, yeah, like you can't end on that. Everyone knows what happened, so you can't unless it's going to come across as comical if you can't, they all know what happened. They all know Francis. They know they lost it. So I don't know if that's part of it that you almost you have to you can't just
Acknowledge.
leave it. You have to acknowledge
And
it.
especially when you did 4 plays about it.
About it, yeah.
You know.
Like, you have put it in their faces already. You can't end on that note. So I don't know if that's also I could certainly see that being the justification. It's like, well, we want to have this triumphalist thing, but we can't just ignore this thing. We have to admit it.
Yeah.
And just be like, you know what? Doesn't matter though. He was great. I mean, that's kind of what it feels like.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
was great. If he had just lived another 15 years, which is probably not true, even if he had, I think he had. The argument I've always heard is that I remember when I took my medieval England class, we talked about this sort of at length. And the argument essentially was that, which I don't know enough about it, but from what we had studied in it during this class was essentially that what was really going on in France was that there was essentially a civil war going on between one of the dukes and the king. And essentially, when Harry wins, when Henry V wins this war, he essentially agrees to just join the king on the king's side in the civil war. And the argument essentially goes, he probably wouldn't have won it in the long run. Like he would have just been stuck in this, sort of internal, infernal, ongoing conflict that he would have just got stuck there. And ultimately, it was better for England to just lose it all out because England also had territory in France during this time that it held as a vassal of the King of France. So technically speaking, the King of England was a vassal of the King of France. So there was like all of this stuff is just creating a really complicated relationship. And in some ways, it was like they're better off. Like they were much better just losing all the territory in France, and then they could kind of focus on their own situation rather than continually trying to fight these stupid wars over there and to claim all of France. So whether it's actually accurate that Henry, if he kept going, would either A, have been able to hold it, or B, whether it would have been good for him to hold it, that's a different story. But I think this one is trying to say, if only he had lived, we would have, it would have been great.
Yes, and it's also Henry's wife, we said this before, is the grandmother to Elizabeth's grandfather. So there's also this kind of idea of if he was the good one, he is the only connection and justification she has for ruling. So if he's the only good one, and if only he lived, things would be great. Well, guess what? He's kind of living again in the person of
Yeah.
Elizabeth. So there's a little bit of you could argue that he can have his cake and eat it too through that kind of balance. Because Henry VI has no, at least maybe cousin to cousin to cousin or something like that, but Henry VI has no real relation to the Tudors. Henry V does, not really, but
I mean,
Catherine
they
does.
they trace their lineage up through Edward III, I'm sure, at some level.
Yeah, at some level, but I mean,
But
probably.
I
I
mean,
mean,
there
they're
would have been a lot of
Scottish.
people. Yeah, but there would have
Yeah,
been a lot of people who would have traced their lineage
yeah,
up to Edward III.
everybody does. But
I think there's
um,
like there's a current there's I think they actually go it's like 70% of people in England can trace their lineage back to Edward III. It's like some enormous number.
I'm pretty close to being able to do it.
Yeah.
There's a few like dark spots in the family tree where I'm like, oh, that person seems to have lived a little too long to for me to say that that was my whatever great grandmother. But it seems like I am. I would be related to Edward III through John of Gaunt,
Yeah,
through like his third wife or something.
there's
Yeah.
just an
Mm,
enormously large number of
mm,
people who can
yeah.
trace their lineage back. So even at this time period, I think there would have been a lot of people who could have traced their lineage
Yeah.
back to Edward III. So it wasn't a
Mm,
particularly good claim.
yeah. But in terms of the character Henry V, and this play, more than the other two we've read so far, relies on the charisma of a single character. That's not really true of the Henry IV plays.
No.
It has Falstaff, it has Hal. We like to hear from Henry IV, obviously. This is relying on this person.
And I think I would say I would say that's true with the exception of Richard III, which is totally relying
Yes.
on the personality of Richard
Hmm.
III in the opposite sense.
Hmm.
This is meant to be sort of the apogee the of this period,
Hmm.
and Richard III is meant to be the nadir of that period. And I think these plays, I don't know if he was intentionally doing it, but they feel like he's putting them in opposition to one another. That that Richard III is sort of the exact opposite of Henry V. And there's that sort of sense here that this is what it was meant to be, and this is what it could happen if the monarchy falls back again, if we keep going back to the bad old days.
Hmm. I agree with that. And I think they're also equally, I don't want to say simple, but equally direct in their praise or attack on their central character. Henry IV, you can say bad things about him, even though ultimately the play likes him. Richard II, you could say plenty of bad things about him, even though ultimately the play likes him. With Richard III, there's not a lot of good things.
Really hard to say
Really hard
anything good
to,
about him.
yeah, yeah. He's really good at killing children. He's very
I
adept
mean,
at.
the only the only justification. Well, we can get to it next week. Well, when we talk about
We
Richard,
do
but I
Richard
mean, he's
III.
he's really hard to give any justice. He's possibly just other than like the bastard characters. He's really the most extreme example. There's not even much of an attempt to justify why he behaves the way he does.
No. And there is a similar kind of hero worship with Henry V. And we see this kind of charisma in non-history plays, I think. So you see it in Hamlet, obviously, who's probably his most charismatic character. Maybe Falstaff is a close second. But I think other than, yeah, as you're saying, Richard III and Henry V, they're the kind of the characters that burn through. And that seems to be far different than, let's say, having Hamlet or Macbeth or somebody like that as your central character, because there's so many implications for things like leadership and how you steer a nation, and then this person kind of is the nation in some sort of sense. And it's interesting to see what he thought of as the ideal charismatic leader in the person of Henry V, which seems to be, and depending on the adaptation, can sometimes come off as a little silly, and I felt that way a little bit with the Brana, even though I ultimately really enjoyed the Brana. Um,
Yeah, so let's move to the movies. Let's move
let's
to the
move to
movies
the
unless yeah
movies. Yeah,
unless we get anything else to say about the play.
not in particular, because the movies they make some changes, which I think are pretty interesting. But let's start with the movies. Let's go to 1944. It's really clear. I think the thesis that Olivier is going with is Shakespeare belongs in film. And he starts that by showing Shakespeare in his original context in the Globe, and then moving him magically into,
Which is a great
it's great.
transition. It's a great sequence. It works. It really does.
Yeah, it works really, really well. And I love the Globe sequence too on
I
its
love
own.
them. I actually kind of part of me was really didn't
Wanted to
want to
stay
leave
there.
it.
Yeah.
I kind of really wanted to stay there, and I understood. I'm like, nah, it might get old after 2 hours, but man, is it good. The opening's the best part of that movie, I think. But
Yeah. The opening is the best part. And the thing is, you can say they rebuilt the Globe in the late 90s. You could do original productions. They have. Mark Rylance did a ton of them. But audiences aren't the same. That's what's different.
no,
Audiences
that's what's
are
great.
very respectful in our modern world. They sit there, they laugh at when they're supposed to laugh, and they're very quiet when they're not laughing. Audiences in Shakespeare's day were not like that at all. They were, and much later than that too. Like Samuel Pepys. If you ever read about him going to the theater in like the 1660s, like he writes in his diary about like masturbating in the theater. It was not like it is today. It was probably closer to like going to a Patriots game or a Giants
Yeah,
game or
I
something
was
like
thinking, yeah,
that.
like yeah, like a rock concert
Mhm.
almost. Like there's just this sense of I didn't know about the Peeps story, but that doesn't surprise me knowing what I know about Peeps. But it was a weird man.
He was a
Um,
weird man, yeah. Mhm.
weird man. But yeah, I mean the sense that you get when you I mean the actors are like high-fiving people out there. Like it's just it looks like it would have just been a joy. Like
Mhm.
it's like it would have been really fun.
Yeah. Yeah, and they threw things at them, at the audience. If they didn't like someone, this idea of throwing tomatoes comes from this time period because people would just throw things at people. They would happily boo you if they didn't like you until they nobody could hear you, and they would have to just change scenes because nobody liked that actor, so they booed him and no one could hear anything, so they had to just move on. And no one cared about continuity because they just didn't like that guy. So it was a real yeah, it was a you get a real sense of that in this play with people laughing and talking and people kind of like being on the stage with them, getting very close to the stage.
Well, even just like the actors themselves. I mean, I love the sequence with like the guys playing the bishops, and when they go backstage, they're just like drinking while they're getting into their new costume, and like people like the guys like hitting him and like get on stage. He like forgets his hat and he's like stumbling out there. I'm like, yeah, this feels very real. Like that
Mm,
really does. Like that
mm,
feels very much like what probably was going on.
yeah. Yeah, and I enjoyed that a lot. And yeah, that was so and then the transition into now we're in film world and all that stuff was really great. And I liked how they did with the Bishop with Canterbury and his assistant or whatnot, where they turn it into just a big spoof. They turned it
Yeah.
into, dropping the papers that
But it makes
have the
sense. It
explanation. And it
kind
makes
of could explain what that scene is because the scene does. I remember even, I read it now. I'm like, it is a weird scene. Like, this is kind of boring. How did you make this work? Why would an audience have sat through this like it's the opening of the Gospel of Matthew or something? Like, why would they sit through this?
yeah.
People do it at church because they're forced to. Why was anybody doing this in the theater?
Mhm.
And the way they performed it, I'm like, oh, that actually would make sense. That
Yeah.
might have been how this worked. I hadn't seen the Olivier version. I've seen some scenes from it, but I'd never seen that opening.
Mhm.
And so the only sequence I think I'd seen was actually the one with the French king when he's the opening sequence with the French
I
king,
love that sequence.
which is a great
Yeah.
sequence. And I actually really like how they portray the French king in this one. And the sequence of the battlefield because I watched it in my war and cinema class in college. And so we when I did war and cinema, we would watch everybody had to watch one movie. And so we did the Branagh Henry V, and then there would be like groups would get split up and then they would watch another movie to pair with it. So they paired the Olivier version. So then that group would have to do a presentation on it and talk about how it was different from the other one. So I've only seen those couple scenes, but it's fascinating to see the whole thing through, and that opening is just really good, and it explains why. You're like, oh, that's how that sequence could have worked in Shakespeare's time. It really made me appreciate a lot more just the plays and how they actually worked and why they were funny and what people were probably doing during them. It's a really great depiction of an actual Shakespeare play.
Yeah. Yeah. And it gets at how that scene would it gets at not only how that scene would probably work, why people would stand there, but it matches the theme as well. Yeah, I love that sequence. And the King of France, it's
It's
played by
great. It's
Harcourt
great.
Williams, who was the artistic director of the Old Vic in the 1920s and 30s.
Oh,
And so he was
like
he was
Kevin
a big deal.
Spacey.
Like Kevin Spacey, he doesn't. His biography seems to be a little different. I don't know why exactly, but he died soon after this. He died in 1956, and a lot of
Oh,
the
that was 12 years. That wasn't
oh yeah, I
soon
guess so.
after.
Yeah, but a lot of these movies, these older movies, even the like As You Like It from the 30s are great because they have these really famous actors that didn't do that many films because they did Shakespeare, and you just even if the movie isn't good, you get a few performances. But he's lovely. He plays the French king as sort of a like a dope who's kind of he kind of forgets where he is now and then. It's really funny.
Well, he's supposed to be. I mean, again, this is like it's somewhat based on history. The reality, and this is why there was like conflict in France and why essentially it was turning into a civil war, was that the king, and this is part of the argument of what was going on with Henry VI, was that the king was completely mentally unstable. But his problem was that he wasn't sort of passive. He apparently would just go into just like basically rubber room murderous rages and would just scream and throw himself against the wall. Like he was completely insane, but he had moments of lucidity. So essentially, France was mostly ungoverned by a king during this period. So I think they're trying to get a little bit of that. And what had the argument is that that's sort of what was going. Henry VI had similar. He didn't have the same problem, but he had a lot of sort of just mental issues, and he would go catatonic at periods. That's why Henry VI is sort of seen as like the saintly king, because the assumption, that they claimed was like he's a mystic. He's communing
He's
with
touched
God.
by God.
Yeah, he's touched by God. He's communing with God during these moments. But the reality was he was catatonic. And so the assumption was that this was sort of a mental condition inherited from his grandfather, essentially. And that was part of the assumption of what was going on there. So I think that's what he's trying to get at, is that the king was actually incapacitated during this period. The French king was. So what they portray him as is more almost sort of dementia-y, but it works. Like it's really very effective for sort of communicating the problems that were going on in the French kingdom. And it's a great performance. It's a really good performance.
Yeah, it's really funny. The French stuff works so much better in the Olivier version.
Yes.
Not just him, but also the Dauphin scene, or the scene where they're discussing the night before the battle, and they're all kind of,
I
kind of,
love how much they hate the Dauphin.
yeah, yeah,
It's just the contempt.
yeah. Which it's so much funnier in the
Olivier
44
version, yeah.
version. Yeah. The other one is like the problem is with Paul Scofield as the king is he's very serious and he's
Well,
very
I think they
scared.
wanted to do that. Like I think
Oh
Branagh
yeah, yeah.
Branagh
I guess
wanted
not a
to make the
problem. It's
Branagh wanted to make the threat like real. He wanted to make it more in your face. Like it was a much more. This is and again the Olivier version presents it visually as more extreme. Like in the Branagh version, there's like four horses. I guess they just didn't have the money. But in the Olivier version, they've got like an army of horses kind of marching, so you can see it physically more. That it looks intimidating. But the actual reality is the foe that they're facing are buffoons, and it's much clearer. Whereas I think in the Brenna version, he wants to make it much grittier. He's trying to do more of like a take on war kind of thing.
yeah. Brana is going for that take
But
on
the
war and
Olivier one,
some.
but the Olivier one is better because it's sort of more in keeping with what I think was actually the play is doing. He's not having to fight against it, and it's just funnier. It just works better.
Yeah, he is making edits. Olivier is in order to lean into that, right? In order to lean into the
Yeah.
heroism. Some of the edits have to do with the Bardolph pistol
Well,
group.
there's numerous edits that Olivier is
Olivier
doing
makes more so
because
than Branagh.
yeah, I
Branagh
mean
seems to just be interested
Olivier.
in time.
Well, yeah, I mean Brand I think is doing it mostly for time. He's doing very little
With
in terms of changing the message.
there is something I think he is changing with the message, but let me hear what you say first.
Well, just the Olivier one, it's fairly obvious why Olivier is cutting it because I don't think it's you were saying the thesis is Shakespeare can be on stage. That is one thesis. I think the other obvious thesis is this is 1944. The other thesis is
Yes.
England is a great country. We have a long history of great warriors and of going into France and winning there, and we will do it again. I mean, that's very clearly one of the most moving scenes is actually, and I think it was intended this way, is when Bardolph and Pistol and Nym and the boy are going off to war, and they show them walking through the streets, and there's other families sort of hugging and saying goodbye as they all march off to war. It's very clear what the parallel he's making
Mhm.
there. But I think what he's doing is, in order to make it that, he has to cut out a lot of the stuff we were talking about before, which is that sort of reality of war type thing. So the main ones I was actually noting them as I went. So the ones I can if I can remember them all, like there was one where he cuts the betrayal scene. There's no the English do not try to betray the king before he goes off to France. I don't think that would play very well. If you're trying to make a triumphalist, you don't want to show that people at home were willing to betray the king. You don't do that. He eliminates the speech before Harfleur, which is a great speech, but he gives Branagh or the Henry that gives this speech before a city that he's besieging and basically says, if you don't open the gates to me now, I'm going to lose control of my troops and they'll rape all of your women and stick all your children and your babies on pikes and they'll murder everyone. So let me in or I'll kill you all. Like it's very clear. They're like, yeah, we can't have that one in there either. Yeah, so he cuts that. He cuts, I'm trying to think the other ones that
Bardolph.
he cuts the Bardolph, he cuts the hanging scene. And there's one more, I think, that he makes like a major, major removal of something that would make them
He
look bad.
Nim also gets killed, right? Doesn't Nim
Doesn't it
get
get killed?
killed in the play also for
It could be a.
yeah, and Branagh cuts that too. Branagh just says Nim get killed in the battle, but Nim also gets cut out of the play. And so at
But
the
either
end,
way,
mhm,
yeah, either way, the point is he's cutting out a lot of the stuff that sort of he adds a little bit of it, like he keeps but it's more makes the enemy look bad. Is like the burning of the baggage car and the murdering of the
mhm,
boys, which is one of only two instances we actually see blood in the play. Really, the only time you see blood is when the boy is dead in the
mhm,
baggage train. The only other time you see it is when I think it's which one is it? It's a pistol that gets hit on the head,
mhm.
and he bleeds. This is the only two times you actually see blood in the movie. So I think he's very clearly trying to make a England is great case, and he's cutting out things that would undermine that point.
Yeah, I think that's true. And Branagh, on the other hand, is leaning into it.
Yeah,
And for some of the same scenes, we see Bardolph being killed, and Branagh not only does that, he juxtaposes it with a scene from Henry IV, Part One, where Bardolph and am I correct about Nim?
I couldn't find it. No, I
Oh,
don't
yeah,
know.
I thought Nim was also, but anyway,
I couldn't
where
find it.
Bardolph and Hal are partying. I actually kind of found that flashback a little awkward, but I see the point he's going for,
To be
right?
fair, that scene is not with Bardolph. That in Henry IV. That
Okay,
sequence occurs with Falstaff.
okay. Well,
That's why it
that's
doesn't.
why it's
That's why it
awkward.
feels
Yeah, yeah,
warped because
yeah.
he doesn't have that party scene with Bardolph. He has the scene when there is a hangman, you will be the you'll be
Yeah.
the hangman. That's with Falstaff. That's
Yeah.
why it comes
It
across as
comes
weird
off
because
as weird. Yeah, okay.
yeah, that's a
Um,
Falstaff scene. Falstaff has those lines, not Bardolph. But it makes sense.
it makes sense,
Okay,
and I think the actual non-flashback portion is very touching. I
yeah,
do like that. The other thing is Pistol's exit is different in the play and the Olivier version in Branagh. In the
is it?
Olivier, it is than in the Branagh. So we have the leek beating scene. So audience,
Yeah, yeah,
there's a character who's Welsh and he's celebrating Saint Denis Day, which is Saint Denis. His emblem was a leek. And so at one point he gets into an argument with Pistol and takes out a leek and starts hitting him on the head and forces him to eat a leek. And kind of, it's a joke. And then after that, Pistol's like, I just got a letter. My wife died from syphilis. I'm deserting. Bye. And it's a very comic scene in both the Olivier and I think in the play as well, because the man is being forced to eat a leek while a Welshman is screaming at him in a traditional Welsh accent. In the Branagh, you don't have the leek scene.
that's true. That scene isn't there yet.
You see him in battle. Nim gets his neck broken, and Pistol is laying on the ground in the battle, crying. And he says, "I got a letter that my wife has died. I'm deserting now." And it ends with him weeping. There's no slapstick. I mean, in the
Yeah, I guess
Olivier,
that's true. Yeah,
it's slapstick. He hits him on the head with a sword, and he goes "Oi!" and almost crosses his eyes and falls over. And then he just leaves. And so what you have is this character who his one friend was executed for robbing a church. His other friend was killed brutally in a battle. The only communication he's had from home is his wife has just died of syphilis. And in tears, he goes, "I'm done. I'm leaving now," and deserts. That is a really different message than getting hit on the head with a leak and going, "Oh, I'm going away now."
yeah.
And I
But I
think,
guess the only thing that I think, and I mean, maybe you're right that it is being played for comic effect in the Olivier version. But the thing they kept, which I was surprised they kept, I thought they would cut it in the Olivier version because of what's going on, is the line where he says, I'll steal back to England and I'll steal. The implication obviously being he's going to go back and become a brigand and a thief.
It's going to
So
be
I was,
cut purse, he says.
yeah, a cut purse. And I was a little surprised to see that in the Olivier version. I guess it's like, well, don't be a deserter because you'll be like Pistol the thief. Like I don't know if that's what it was trying to do, but it was a weird one. I was like, oh, I'm surprised they kept that.
Yeah, well, he's an idiot. I mean, that seems to
True.
be what it is in the play. He's an idiot, and he's also a thief, and his friends are, it's just he's a big dummy. And if you're a low class person, you stay true to the message. You go forth. You don't converse with the Irish, and you just battle
That
on with the French.
that's the
Um,
other thing that I was gonna say is the fact that they really don't like the Irish in the Olivier version. I think that's not just because Branagh was Irish. I think it's because the Irish were neutral during the war. They want to make the Irish aren't participating. The Welsh and the Scots are participating in World War II on the English side. The Irish aren't. So I think they're trying to basically make the Irish look like idiots because they're not participating. I think if the Irish had participated, you don't get that
get
sequence.
that cut. That makes
You
sense.
get that sequence gets cut. You don't make Macmillan or whatever his name was, look like an idiot. But because the Irish aren't there, they will be merciless against, because they will
Against
just
them.
be merciless against
Yeah.
them.
In the Branagh version, they have the same lines, but the Irish actor, the actor playing the Irishman, is standing up for himself. He's playing those lines in a different way. He's playing them
Yeah.
in a different objective. It's
Any
more to
man who
tell.
talks about my country and my man is a
Mhm.
liar and and he's just like,
Yeah,
yeah, he's basically like, don't you talk about it, don't
yeah.
you dare.
Well, in the
Whereas,
Olivier version, he's a dummy, so he's
yeah,
just can't figure out what's going on.
who's talking about my country? Like it's literally like, wait, what? What are you talking about? Oh, and he's like, you might as well have like a green suit and a shillelagh. Like he's
Little
literally.
leprechaun
I
and
mean, he basically is a leprechaun. So
Notre Dame hat on. Yeah,
they put a giant shamrock on him
they
to
do.
make sure you know who he is.
Yeah.
Like they're making it very clear that they're making fun of this man.
Yeah, it's actually so much so that the first time I think I watched the scene, I didn't. I'm like, "Wha- is he that stupid? Am I missing something? And I had to rewatch. And go, oh no, they're
He's not
going at this
stupid.
guy.
He's Irish.
He's Irish. Yes.
I say
Um,
that as an Irish citizen and a very Irishman. They don't like the Irish in this
yeah,
play.
they did not like the Irish in the in Shakespeare's day either.
No,
They were
no,
the
I don't think Olivier is inserting that. I
no,
think it's
he's not.
very
He's just
intentional.
highlighting it.
Yeah, I think he's certainly highlighting it, but it's not. That is in the play.
Then yeah, and Branagh does something lighter with it. But in terms of what I think Branagh is doing, is Branagh is I think he's trying to have his cake and eat it too, as I've said before, and I think he's kind of getting away with it. I like that. I think sometimes his Henry comes off as a little crazy
Yeah,
because he's so emotional. He cries a lot. There's that scene. It's a beautiful scene where he picks up the body and they walk forward. And
I
there's
love
this,
that shot. I
I
love
it,
the shot. I love the extended movement of the camera. I love the music. The guy who did the soundtrack is the guy who starts singing. That's the
oh,
composer.
okay.
But it's just I think it's just beautiful. Like I think it's just a really the colors in it are a beautiful
Hmm.
shot. It's probably my favorite moment of the movie. I love in the background when they have the old lady comes charging at him to go
Oh,
attack Henry
and they
and
push him
the
away,
yeah,
push her away.
the French, the French, what's it called? The
The
not minstrel,
Herald
the
guy, yeah.
herald. The French herald has to like tackle her to the ground. It's just there's a lot. It's a really good
Hmm.
sequence and it's beautiful. The music is beautiful. Like everything about it. That's damn. I really like the sequence. I agree. It's melodrama, but I think it's really good.
I don't know if it's just melodrama.
Well, it is. I mean,
There,
Henry
I
being
think
like,
there,
as he
yeah.
carries the corpse. I mean, it.
I think the
It's
thing is, it's using melodrama, but I think it is also there's plenty of space in which Brenna undercuts it throughout the
yeah.
play. I
Well,
think
because
he's
he wins.
mhm.
There is a sense here of he gets what he really wanted. And so it's a little hard for him it's a little disingenuous for him to sort of say like, "Oh, what a terrible thing I did." I mean, even the Brian Blessed is, again, it's one of the best Brian. I love Brian Blessed in it, but there's the one where he says something like when they're reading the number of the French dead, and they're emphasizing, it's like of 15,000 dead or whatever, of whom 2,000 were newly named knights, which means they were boys essentially. They were probably 18-year-old kids that were murdered. And Brian Blessed has the line where he says, "'Tis glorious." There's this sense of like, I mean, it's great that we did this, but this was a really bad thing that we did. Again, going back to like Oppenheimer, there's sort of an Oppenheimer-esque sense of like almost what he's trying to do with this is it's great that we won as opposed to losing, but it's kind of bad what we did here. Like a lot of people died. Like there's this sense of you can't just celebrate the fact that we just killed 15,000 people. Like there has to be a sense of sadness at that. And I think the Branagh version can get away with that. That's what war is. Like you're glad you won. Maybe we shouldn't have won quite so much. Like that's almost the sense here of what it is.
I think so, and I think that's why it's not just melodrama. I think that's why those scenes work because they're balanced with a would you call it a criticism? At least
It's certainly critical of war.
it is, yeah, yeah, a critical
I
eye
guess I guess
towards war itself as um, if at best we could say it's a necessary thing, it's a horrible necessary thing, and at least you should acknowledge that. And I think he is adapting it. He's making editorial choices in order to show that. And I think highlighting the Bardolph scene, he is highlighting that a
yes.
lot. And he's adding into it from earlier plays in order to highlight that scene. And I think that big change where we take out the comic leak scene because he wants to show that this man is ruined and he gets nothing from this. Everything is lost, and all he can become now is a thief. In the Branagh version, that works really well. What does war do to the poor? It turns them into thieves. For the people who survive, they have to go back to England and steal. And if he gets caught, he's going to be killed, and everybody's going to cheer the nobility of the man who will make the sacrifice to execute his former friend for doing a crime. He is not above the law. He's going to maintain the law, but it's pretty horrible that this is what happens. And I think that's what Branagh is cranking
Yeah.
up. The
I think that's exactly it.
problem
I guess the
is
only thing I will say is I guess what I mean by melodrama is again I really like the sequence, but it maybe you might be pushing a little over the top as you have the king carry a dead child across a battlefield of people crawling through mud as you sing Te Deum and have a mother running across the field to go attack him. Well, like it's a beautiful sequence, and maybe he's justified it, maybe he's earned it, and that's why he gets away with it and it's a really good sequence. But I think it's just and then he gets to stand on a cart for some reason, holding the body as the
I
music
I
swells and the
think
camera
that's
moves out.
supposed to be an Olivier reference
It
because
is. It's
Olivier's
clearly
on the
yes, it is definitely an Olivier reference, which I didn't get until I saw the movie. It is absolutely an Olivier reference because Olivier does the exact same thing and stands on the cart when he does his triumphant speech. It's definitely an Olivier reference, but it's a little over the top when you just have him standing there for no reason holding a dead child on a cart as you zoom out and show all the body. It kind of has that. It almost has that like Gone with the Wind feeling when they
Hmm.
zoom out and you see just like the bodies on bodies on bodies on bodies.
Yeah, the it is, I think, slightly over the top. The difference for me between this and something like Gone with the Wind is that you have a character who is close to a messiah complex.
Yeah, I mean he earns I'm
He,
saying he earns it. I think he
yeah,
earns
oh,
it.
I think he
But
earns it.
it's
I
a
think
it's still a little over the
it's a
top. But I
little
think he earns
much,
it. If he
but
stretched it out another 30 seconds or if he did any, something else in there, I think he could have botched it. I think he just makes it.
yeah, I think he's on the edge.
Yeah.
I
But
think
it
he's
works.
purposefully on the edge. I think that's what he's going for. But there is a thing with his version that didn't come out from reading it. It doesn't come out from the Olivier, which is a little bit more, and this man comes off as crazy. This man is
Yeah.
very close to, thinking he's God on earth, and so on and so forth. It works out. He wins the battle. He does have the right opinions about things. We see this in A Little Hal in the Night in Act 4.
That's a great and I that's better. I think that's better with
Branagh,
Branagh.
I agree.
Branagh's little Hal in the Night is a better sequence than Olivier's. Olivier's kind of comes off as a little boring. Like it's
Yeah.
just it's boring.
Mhm.
I kind of was like, can we just move on? Just get to the crispy speech. I don't you hearing you very subtly argue this point about how the king is not responsible for his men's sins or something with people who don't seem all that interested in it that was just such an underplayed moment and it in a quiet scene anyway. I don't think it worked. Even his praying when he gets back, they cut out the sequence and the references in the Olivier version. In the Branagh version, or in the play, he prays and he acknowledges that he had sinned against Richard, or his
No,
father
Branagh
had sinned
does
against
that.
Richard,
Yeah.
and he'd sinned against Richard. And he's like, "Please, God, do not
Mhm.
take your revenge
Yeah, I
today."
have cried more tears than drops of blood he's bled.
Yeah, and please, just of all days, you can take your revenge when you want it, but not today. Like that's his prayer. Is like, I get it. You're going to punish us someday for this, but just not today. Don't punish us today. And that's his prayer, and that gets just completely cut from the Olivier version.
Well, you can't
And
have that, right?
clearly not. But the sense that Olivier doesn't seem like he's really suffering at all. There doesn't seem to be any sense. That's why I don't know if you'd call it a God complex. He seems to be tortured in that particular sequence. That's his Gethsemane.
That's,
It has a
yeah,
much more of a Gethsemane
I
sequence.
agree. I
It's
think,
just such a good sequence in
yeah.
Branagh.
Yeah, I agree. I think that sequence does a lot because I think I think he's on the border, right? I think if you don't have that sequence, if you don't have him praying, if you don't have, um, his reaction to the dead children and whatnot, it gets close to everybody has to die, so I get France. Branagh gets close to that line. He never goes over that, and I think a reason for that is that sequence is really tense. A Little Howl in the Night sequence
Great.
in
Yeah.
Branagh is really tense because they're arguing like to the point of fighting about the ethics of this and who's responsible and who isn't. Like those people really care about getting this argument correct. And so it makes it feel a lot more suffering. And having Brown actually say the lines and not voiceover like Olivier
That is a
does.
really dumb scene. Yeah, I'm like,
Yeah,
oh, you didn't know how to do this, did you?
yeah.
They
They
had
have
to
that
play
choice.
it because I'm like, it was just hilarious watching because I'm like, how did he when he filmed this? I'm guessing he was saying the monologue to himself in his head, but it's like he clearly was like, I gotta at least move my eyes occasionally. He just kind of like flicks his eyes away sometimes. He'll just kind of look away. I'm like, this is very awkward staring at this man, this man to say these lines in his head.
And
And
it's
I'm
so
like,
disappointing because you want to see Olivier say them. You want to, it's like the great Shakespearean actor. But with Branagh, that whole sequence it does feel, my God, there's a lot on the head of a king. Like everybody else can go to sleep. I'm responsible for everyone. I can't go to sleep.
and I love the way he says ceremony. I like how he says ceremony. I really like that.
Mhm. Yeah, that sequence does a lot for him. Um, and that's probably part of the charisma. I think it's essential for the charisma because without that and other things,
He is he's mad.
he's a
He's
madman.
insane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I guess the in the Olivier version, I'd say he's more of a messianic figure. It's just he is and he knows it.
Mhm.
It's not a madness. He is the messianic figure. He is right. There's no sense of doubt
Yeah, he's
that he
Churchill.
yeah, that's a great yeah, it's great. He's Churchill. There's no sense that this man is mad. There's no sense that he's wrong. He's totally right. And that's this, whereas the Branagh version, yeah, he's a little crazy. I can't remember if this was in a critic had said this at the time, or whether this is something Olivier or Branagh had said he was going for. I can't remember what it was, but the sequence somebody once said that whether it was Branagh or a critic that when he comes in, the great sequence in the very beginning when Henry V walks in and the sort of the door opens and he walks in, the effect is of it's the effect of Darth Vader. It's Darth Vader entering at that point. It's sort of if you just played the Empire music over that and had him walking in with his giant cape through the sort of steaming door into this darkened room, it's like Darth Vader. And there is this sense that this is sort of an Anakin-y kind of guy that he, and maybe that's why he cries so much, is that is that this man is
His crying
something.
is convincing, though, Pat.
Yes, I still haven't seen the second movie because like it's so I've just seen some of the sequences of it and it's so bad. They're like, and the women and the children. It's such a bad movie. But he has sort of this Darth Vader-y kind of quality going on in the Branagh version, where this man is just this, what is he gonna do? Even, the sequence before Harfleur you get the sense, I mean, the senses that they're giving in the Branagh version is he's gonna lose if the city doesn't surrender. So he just gets up there and he says he acts like a madman, and he basically tells them, "I will spit your children on pikes if you don't let me in there." And you kind of get the sense of it's clear that he's bluffing, but they don't know that he's bluffing. If you saw a man say this, you probably would go, "Yeah, maybe we should let him in." Like that's his, he is kind of a madman, and it works. It's a good choice. But I agree in the sort of where you get to see him act as a sane man, though, is when you see, man, a lot of this is a bluff. He's not so sure of himself either, and that's why that sequence, A Little Howl in the Night, really works. I hadn't thought about that because if you don't get that, you're right. He's just insane.
Yeah, he's just insane and happens to win.
Yeah,
It's, because they're outnumbered. What is it, 5-1?
5-1 or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, whatever it is. Yeah. So that sequence is.
Now the real reason they win. This is one of the things we talked about in War and Cinema. So there's three main. Do you know what the three main reasons they win?
I don't know.
So again, this is so each of them hints at it in different ways, and you can see it. There's certain shots where they know what they're very intentionally focusing on it. One are obviously the bowmen. That's like the most famous thing. Is that the bowmen at Agincourt? The English had a lot of bowmen, relatively speaking. They didn't have a lot of cavalry, they didn't have a lot of infantry, but they had an enormously large number of bowmen and regular long bowmen who could fire up to I think like 5 arrows a minute. Like, and they were pretty good and they were pretty accurate. So they could find chinks in armor and this kind of stuff. The French actually had brought in, they show this in the Olivier, you can see it. And again, they're clearly trying to emphasize it. The French had brought in the latest technology, which were essentially crank bows, where you would crank the bow and you'd put the arrow into it and then you could fire it. And those bolts could pierce armor. So they could actually really do some serious damage. But the problem is it took like a minute to load them. So by the time they weren't useful because they would just get killed or they would get overrun or they just couldn't fire enough arrows to make it worthwhile. But Olivier specifically shows the French actually with those things. Again, you might not miss it if you don't know that it's there, but he specifically shows them. That's one. The second thing is that the French, this is the origin of the phrase, get off your high horse. The French refused to get off their horses because knights fought on horse. The English, generally speaking, were willing to get off their horses, and so they show that the field in Agincourt was super muddy. So they show this in the Olivier version. They show them like walking through like little puddles. The Branagh version, I think, gets better, where they really show the mud. But basically, the horses all got stuck. The horses couldn't fight, and when the knights fell off, they couldn't get up. And so basically, that was the second major reason. The third one, which Olivier shows in Branagh, or Branagh can't show at all, is if you look at it from the air, and you can see it again in the Olivier version when they show the aerial shot, that Henry picked his territory where he was going to fight perfectly. He picked a spot where if you looked at it from a distance, you couldn't see that actually the forest came inwards about maybe 30 or 40 yards. So it was wider at one end and then it narrowed towards the other end. So he knew, Henry V knew that the territory narrowed inwards, but the French didn't. So when the huge, a line of horses comes marching down, it looks like they can fit, and then they actually can't. So they get forced together. And so suddenly they all start banging into each other, and then they don't have enough room to maneuver, and they can't turn around because all the rest of the army is bunching up on them. So basically, that's why it was such a slaughter because the horses couldn't move. They all got jammed together because the forest narrowed, and the English just picked them off with their bows. So that's why it actually was such a slaughter. And each movie kind of hints at it in different ways as to how it was working and why it was so bad for them.
I did not know that. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. I'd like to look back at the at Olivier's version
Yeah, if you
and
look at it's really
see how he captures
interesting.
that.
Yeah, if you look at Olivier's one, because he shows a very specific. Again, I haven't seen the movie since that sequence is the only. This is from my Warren cinema classes, what we talked about. And so if you look at the Olivier one, he actually shows it in his matte paintings from the aerial view. You can see that the woods, that they're actually on opposite ends of the woods, and you can see that the woods actually come inwards and narrow towards the other end of them. But this is, again, I find it interesting how they each kind of adapt themselves. Branagh just didn't have the money, so he couldn't show all the horses in the
Yeah,
woods.
he couldn't show that. I like the fight sequence though
It's better,
of
yeah.
his. It's very very wet. It's very muddy. It seems like it's borrowing a little more from Chimes. Just because
Yeah.
it's not entirely doing what Chimes is doing. Chimes is kind of we're all just going back into the mud and nobody could tell what from what. It isn't quite that, but he's still taking some things from it.
I just remember a teacher joking at the end when he goes, "What castle is this that lies hard by?" And they go, "How could you see it? The amount of fog, the amount of fog there is around you and mist. You couldn't possibly see a castle that's anywhere near you."
Yeah.
At least Olivier was like, "There's the castle. It looks like it came out of a
I
medieval manuscript or a
mhm,
painting from the
mhm,
rose. What is it? The Rose poem or whatever that one is." But
yeah.
it's just like, yeah.
Yes, because it is a painting. It's a painting
Yeah,
on
it
a
is. I know
wall.
it is a painting, but they're not even they're not attempting. I think they could have done obviously more realistic. It's not meant to, but it's not
Yeah,
meant
I
to
think
be.
he's
It's
not. He
it's meant
doesn't
to
want to
be.
be
It's
too
stylistic.
realistic.
No, you
Yeah,
don't want to. I'm not saying it's an error. This isn't that's the style that they wanted.
yeah, yeah. Because it gets more realistic as it goes. Because it goes the first jump is to when they're going on the ships, right? And that's slightly more it's not on the globe, but it's stagey, and then it gets broader as it goes along before it goes returns back to the globe again. Um, I just say I also much preferred not the woman who played Catherine in the Olivier version, but that scene. I think in the Olivier version, I think he
I don't know. I
is.
think I like the Branagh one more, but
Did you? Well,
yeah, I like the Branagh one more.
I think Emma Thompson is a
I think I
lot
like Emma
better.
Thompson. I think I
Yeah,
like Emma Thompson maybe, but
yeah. I liked Olivier more than I liked Branagh in that sequence. Um, I'm not entirely sure why. There's something sort of regally charming there.
yeah, I don't know. I guess that's why I liked maybe the Branagh one more because again, Henry's argument is I'm not a good wooer. Like I'm a soldier and I can't, and again, I like even Branagh's one where he's like, I'll talk to you in French even though it will hang upon my tongue. It will hang upon my tongue like a newlywed wife about her husband hardly to be shook off, which I just think is just a great sequence of words. But the Branagh one, I don't know. I think I like the Branagh one more. I feel like you get more a sense of this. This man is way in over his head. Like this is not what he's comfortable doing. And I guess that's why I thought that was a better. Why I like that.
I like her a lot more. Catherine sort of disappears in the Olivier one. I think Emma Thompson and Branagh were they married by that point?
They were if they weren't married,
They
they were
were
certainly an item
yeah circling the airport.
until he botched that.
He
But
sure did. But regardless, uh, any closing thoughts about these films?
nah, I mean, other than they're both worth they're
Both worth
both
your
worth
time.
watching. They really are, and they in each one it's a fascinating sense of adaptations because they have totally different purposes. They're generally using the same material with only relative changes, and they when you watch one and then watch the other, they sort of you see things you didn't see in the other ones. They're really great adaptations. They're both worth the time easily. No one wouldn't always say that about some adaptations. These are both worth your time.
They're both worth your time, and they're both doing different things. So you can see what you can do with one play. Um,
What they show is how the director is also storyteller. The
yeah,
director really is changing what the real story is, and the director really makes those choices and those changes.
yeah, and they're also good for both these actors because Olivier, his contribution for Shakespeare is he makes it film. He does that a bunch of times. He wins a bunch of Oscars doing it. And he justifiably is the person who shows Shakespeare can work on film. Branagh is styling himself as the modern Olivier. He's intentionally doing that.
He's making Shakespeare modern, not in a false sense. He's not taking Henry V and turning it into a, the South Side of Chicago. Like he's making it into he's modernizing Shakespeare, but in a very traditional sense.
Hmm. Yes. Yeah. And it seems like Branagh is and doing Henry V. Henry V seems to be the play where you declare a new space, be it the Globe, be it film, or be it I'm the man now. I'm the guy who's going to handle this mantle.
Well, I think what Henry V is doing is he's Shakespeare can be a blockbuster.
Hmm.
Shakespeare
Yes,
can
that's what I
be,
mean.
Braveheart isn't there, but Shakespeare can be Braveheart.
Hmm.
That's what I think he's trying to do. He's saying this is modern cinema. This is I'm declaring that Shakespeare can be doesn't have to be buttoned up. It doesn't have to be Romeo and Juliet, the Baz Luhrmann. Is it Baz? No, what's his name? Is it Baz Luhrmann?
Baz Luhrmann. It
That
is.
thing. It doesn't have to
Romeo
be that.
plus Juliet.
Yeah, that's why I was trying to think. I was trying to emphasize the and, but yes, Romeo plus Juliet. It's hard to emphasize the word and.
Hmm.
But yes, Romeo plus Juliet. It doesn't have to be that, but it also doesn't need to be Shakespeare. It can be a blockbuster. It can be Braveheart. It can be just a just a good big Hollywood film. That's what I think he's doing.
Yeah, and Olivier was in, God, he was in theater for like more than a year with this. I mean, people loved this movie, and yeah, and people, love the Branagh one. It wasn't as successful as the Olivier one, but I don't know. We've seen the next person to do this, the next person to take up this
No,
mantle.
they don't
I mean,
exist. They don't exist. Yeah.
Branagh's in his 60s, but we're not seeing the next great Shakespearean play. And I don't
No.
know what it would look like either. That's the thing. I don't know what else you would do at this point. But I still think there's like a lot of possibility for this, and uh, there's a lot of room for someone to come in and continue Shakespeare in this kind of cinematic language.
Audience, Tom has thrown the gauntlet.
Yes, yes.
You
Audience,
must, yes,
yes.
audience, you must. AJ, you.
Uh, if you enjoyed Henry V, check out Gus Van Sant's My Own Private Idaho. If you enjoyed Henry V, check out Gus Van Sant's My Own Private Idaho from 1991 with Keanu Reeves as a Hal figure of sorts. Try the 15-part Age of Kings from 1960 with Robert Hardy and Judi Dench. The King from 2019, though it may be best to avoid that one. I can't remember his name. He's really famous right now. He's a small little man. Timothy Chalamet. Timothy Chalamet is playing Hal. It is a dreadful movie. Robert Pattinson from Twilight fame plays the Dauphin, and he's the one redeeming thing
Yeah,
in that
supposedly he's pretty
movie.
good. Supposedly he's like a pretty solid actor.
He's really good in The King. The King is unwatchable until he comes up, and you're like, oh God, this is so much more better. Yeah, anyway, and we also have the BBC Shakespeare with David Gilwim as the King, and that's from 1979. You can rate and review this show anywhere fine podcasts are available. For those viewing in YouTube land, if you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the Talking Studios channel for all our exciting content, and follow us on social media at Talking Studios. Check out other shows by Talking Studios, including Talking Pictures Trivia, where we explore movies through trivia, Keep Making Movies, where we explore micro-budget films, Limited Lexicon, where we play through text-based adventure games, and Get the Point, where we slowly reveal a movie poster and try to guess which movie poster it is. Got a question for us? Call the Talking Studios hotline at 201-467-8679 and leave a message. It may be featured on a future episode. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Adapt It, wherever fine podcasts are found. Join us next time when we discuss the play Richard III and its adaptations.
Wow, Talking Studios.
Next week, we'll be discussing Richard III. Pat, if you could play one role in this play, what would it be?
So let's start with what role would I play? I think anyone's gonna want to play Richard.
Yeah.
Like anyone's gonna want to do it. I don't think I probably could. I don't think I'd get cast in it. So that would be the answer to that. Who are you gonna play? You're gonna play Richard. Whom did I get cast as?
Who did you get cast as, Pat? I wonder.
I got cast as Richmond. Like truly one of the most boring characters in this entire play. But I did get cast as him. Um, who would I probably play? I could see myself playing the Archbishop who has to go get the strawberries.
Strawberries.
Strawberry. But I have brought these strawberries for him. That's probably what I'd end up as.
Oh,
So I'm gonna go with that.
yeah.
Tom, what about you? Who would
Yeah.
you play?
So I've been cast in this play twice, and one of them I actually end up
Oh, I
not
didn't know
being
you
able
twice.
to do. Yeah. So I was cast as Catesby in the production, which the audience I know you don't know who Catesby is unless you just saw this. He's one of the thugs who helps Richard. I was also cast as Clarence later
Oh,
on.
that's a good role.
That is a good role, and I couldn't do it. I ended up just not having the time
That
available
stinks.
at the
That's a fun
time.
role. I like that
But
role.
that's a really good role, and I was very surprised to get cast as Clarence. Who would I be good at? I don't know. I actually don't know if I would be a good Clarence. I'm not entirely sure why I was cast as Clarence. I
I think you'd
think
make a good Rivers. That's what I thought. I thought you played Rivers, not Catesby. I think you'd make a good Rivers.
I think I'd make a good Rivers. Yeah, I think I make a yeah. I think I would make a good Rivers now. Maybe I'm a little old. Depends on how you cast it. I think when I'm older, I would make a decent Buckingham.
Yeah.
But I think yeah, like Rivers or Clarence, I would like. Tyrrell would be fun. I'm a fairly large man. I think often Tyrrells are large people because he's
He's
murdering
a
people.
murderer.
He's a murderer, and murderers have to be large according to intimidation
Or they
reasoning.
have to be really tiny and slimy. Like you
Yes.
can't like they're usually not the unassuming men.
Yeah, you can't be a middleweight murderer. You have to go heavy or go fly.